to say we want more data protection laws, but is it going to solve the problem if more laws are adopted, but the content of those laws is not acceptable? So we also debated the use of the existing precedents. Can we look at these 16 laws that have been adopted around Africa and have a look at what is good about them, what is bad about them, and come up with some kind of sort of do's and don'ts to assist the countries that haven't adopted laws. And in terms of practical recommendations, what we ultimately settled on is that we probably need to look into something like a model law on data protection, which is similar to, for example, what was done by the African Commission on with the model law on access to information, which has done quite well in terms of assisting countries around the continent. So that's one of the actionable points. So if there's any research institution that wants to take that up and prepare the model law, I think that would be a great thing. And then secondly, we talked about the fact of why is it that legislation has not been adopted in light of the fact that we, for example, have the AU Convention, we've got the ECOWAS directive and all of those things that we talked about. Why is it that this is not happening? And some of the points that were raised is that perhaps it's actually because in most African countries, we are dealing with a lot of very pressing issues. And data protection doesn't immediately jump out at you as something that needs to be dealt with, whether it's members of the public or regulators. So it's just not a priority. And so what we came up with as a potential action plan was the fact that there needs to be advocacy to actually get people out there to know why data protection is important. Some of the things we talked about in this room today needs to be translated into normal speak and put out there into the public domain for people to get to understand their rights and for regulators to start to understand. And one of the points that was raised is that perhaps the imminent implementation of the GDPR is one of the good sort of touchstones that could be used to create some urgency around the need for a conversation about data protection and how it's going to impact people, because it can actually be translated into an economic impact, which people are far more likely to react to in terms of urgency than a sort of generalized possibility that my data will somehow be disclosed. And in that regard, we spoke about potentially bringing together the national human rights commissions across Africa. Because the other thing that in this context, the other thing we were talking about is how do we mainstream human rights within the discussion around data protection and turn it away from being an ICT issue, which is the next point that we talked about. And we said perhaps we should get the national human rights institutions across Africa to come together and to actually adopt a position around this issue, give them some training and capacity building to understand that this is a privacy issue, and let them go back and take up those lines of communication that they already have open with various governments to say, we believe this is a privacy issue, we believe it's a human rights issue, and therefore there's a reason for you to actually go ahead and adopt these laws. One of the debates we had but didn't quite settle on was what about the domestication of the AU Convention? Because if that already exists, do we then need to supplant it with a model law? And one of the concerns, of course, was that not all of the content of the AU Convention is ideal. So that's sort of one of the things we kind of left open is, should we be starting with the AU Convention and trying to push and make a big push towards advocacy towards ratification of the AU Convention instead? Okay. So the second area of difficulty that was identified in Lola's research was the data protection is treated as an ICT issue. So it's seen as something for IT people to talk about, and it's not something that other people need to be concerned about. Or it's an e-commerce issue, and that's it. And I've already mentioned the issue of potentially getting the national human rights institutions across Africa together to adopt a position and to start pushing it within their territories as a privacy issue, because they already have a profile as being concerned with human rights issues. It's already part of their mandate, etc. And then there was also a suggestion that perhaps there can be use made of the ECOSOC committee that's been set up by the AU to actually start with that as the first starting point for advocacy and discussion around this issue. Excuse me. Thirdly, we talked about the fact that a number of the pieces of legislation that have been adopted contain very broad exemptions with issues around national security and the fact that your data privacy can be overridden because of those things, but without actually giving proper parameters, which could lead to a breach of your privacy. And what we said was that ultimately, this is not something that's very easy to discuss in a vacuum, because in fact what needs to happen is that in the process of the adoption of the various pieces of legislation that need to be taken up in all the countries that have not yet adopted the laws, and potentially as amendments in the countries where laws have been adopted, we need to look at how these laws are drafted. We need to have clarity around the definitions of concepts like national security. We need to have clarity around structures of who is going to take decisions and rights of appeal and the like. So it's a legislative drafting issue. And then one of the proposals was that perhaps to create some impetus for countries that have already adopted these pieces of legislation to change their laws to the extent that they are not compliant, is that it should be treated as an issue that is reportable under the already existing requirements to report back on your fulfillment of your human rights obligations at the African Commission, for example. So yeah, that was, yeah. The fourth point was, the fourth point was the issue about outdated laws that, and I think it was mentioned during the presentation earlier as well, that African countries are basically chasing something from 22 years ago because we are relying on EU 1995, the EU Data Protection Directive from then to shape our own laws. And that led us to a conversation about how do we actually keep these laws flexible, considering the fact that this is an ICT issue, and this is one of the fastest moving sectors in the world. So it's actually difficult to regulate this sector effectively, because if it's going to take 5-6 years to push through a bill to amend it, by the time you get to the amendment, what we were trying to implement has already become obsolete. So what we debated was that perhaps when these laws are being drafted, there needs to be more flexibility in the way it's drafted, and leaving more space for national regulators to have the power to adopt regulations and to adopt codes of conduct in a broad sense, so that they can change it as things change, because they have the ability to react faster than taking it back to Parliament. So yeah, those were the things that we discussed and some of the recommendations that we had. Thank you.
Okay, so our group had to look at strengthening knowledge base and capacity on data privacy and security. And our goal was looking at developing an Afro-centric capacity building curriculum on data protection, data privacy, and security. We started out by throwing out some moot questions to start the discussions. And one of the questions we asked was whether or not we needed to have formal or informal approach in terms of dealing with this issue of capacity building. We looked at the issue of, thank you. So we looked at the, okay. So we looked at the issue of, you know, getting our own certification in place for African countries. Now, the challenges we acknowledged existed in terms of following this approach was getting the right organization that will build in the integrity framework which is needed for such certifications, and getting it recognized beyond our borders or beyond the African borders. We also asked the question of, so if there is any certification program of that nature at all, or there's some kind of formal education, whether it's degrees that are being churned out, which organizations can actually champion this. Some of the discussions that came out pointed to it being industry-driven. Some looked at using existing universities and frameworks that currently exist in the formal university sector. We also looking at partnerships. So one of the issues that came up is currently the international body that has certificates, practicing certificate programs for data protection practitioners around the world. And the example was given of a possible partnership between some of these agencies and our traditional educational systems and structures. We looked at whether it was going to be formal, training and degrees or certification vis-a-vis informal training, such as workshops, seminars, and basic awareness creation tools that could be used as well. It also came out that it's important to look at developing a practitioner's content as well. And mention was also made of the African Association of African Universities as a possible stakeholder to engage in terms of developing these issues further. That is at the Pan-African level. In terms of the informal, we also made mention of the need to use the media, and here we are talking about the formal media, social media, and other engagements. There was also mention of, raising capacity on data protection at the lowest level possible. So starting with even clubs, school clubs that currently exist in terms of training and awareness building on how they should engage themselves online and the like, and also looking at grassroots advocacy. The priority areas to target, which came out, was looking at government, academia, and then putting in place a media strategy. We also had comments on the need to map out, because it's very important, map out what currently exists in this area. So if there is another university or there's an existing body that is already doing some kind of capacity building, then we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So we can engage or see how best we could interact with them to ensure that we are able to make headway in this area. To round it all up, we were asking the question, where do we start? And it came out quite strongly that it has to start with the network that brought us here today. And they need to look at developing a knowledge pack, putting together researchers, policymakers, etc., to develop appropriate information tools that can help drive this agenda, putting together a communication strategy, and then driving that communication strategy. Also, we needed to look at a training the trainer scheme that can also help in promulgating or promoting awareness creation at the highest level. And finally, we were made to know that we need to really understand, in order to do this in the first place, we really need to understand what space we are in to enable us put all these together. So thank you.
Can we put our hands together for both things, please? Okay, so we will just continue. If we have questions, suggestions based on the group feedbacks. So the floor is open. If you have questions, please, can you show of hands? Comments?
Okay, there was, I think there was a mention of, organizations who actually provide privacy, certifications and whatever. You guys want to look at IAPP? Yeah, well, I was just suggesting because I got certified with them and they're pretty good, actually. And they're actually pretty good. So you could probably just tell them that you may want to have a center here or something like that.
We have. Currently, I have a license with them to run Africa, but okay, so we discussed this. I didn't want to bring it up. The challenge we have is that I've engaged with the IAPP in terms of capacity building for Africa. However, currently, you know that most of their programs, especially on the legal front, are country specific. So we started engaging on working with them to develop an Africa specific, because they have the US, they have Canada, they have Europe, they have Asia. So we started talking about developing an Africa specific curriculum for practitioners. The challenge they have is that they've already done their plan and strategy for 2018. And so we agree that we will start scoping out with their certificate in privacy management, and then we will do the legal aspect of it. Then after 2018, we can look at whether there is a real need, because they are also market driven as well.
Because I sit on the working group that does some of those planning. So I don't remember it actually came up to my group, but I would certainly...
Yeah, because I started the discussions in September at the International Regulators Conference with Trevor. So we more or less began after October. Yeah.
Okay. I'll probably take it up with the group and see whether we can fast track that.
Thank you, Prof. Chris. Any other questions or suggestions? Mike?
Okay, it's a question, and I'm here as an undergraduate student, and I'm thinking that this discussion is sounding like it's staying only in the terrain of the elite and the knowledgeable. What is the force that is being put behind this data issue, data protection issue, to getting the word out there on the street for every single person to know about it, knowing that their privacy is being infringed at every second of the day, and then what they can do when they notice that stuff like this are going on around them? And then is there a way where this can be adopted into the curriculum or educational curriculum? Like, even it boils down to the secondary schools. Is it possible for we to have in the curriculum where the students in the secondary schools get to learn about the Constitution? Because if in the secondary schools the Constitution is being taught and they get to memorize it, they know it by heart, stuff like this would not really become something we have to even camp around under a conference, you know. So I'm saying, is there a way this awareness could get more practical and real, and we don't just talk about it like some high and lofty stuff that we have to, you know. So is there a way it can get out there on the street and everybody knows that their privacy is being infringed by the second?
Okay. Okay, I'll take that question. No, I just want to say, well, it's not a perfect world, but in the US, for example, the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, has actually started doing a lot of awareness sessions with, you know, in schools, you know, so they, from the ground level going up to university level. What they're doing is they're doing practical sessions with them, teaching the small kids how to deal with the internet, how to deal with, you know, information, how to deal with things, what can you put up there. And each class, it's like, you know, you're going up in one level, so they're making sure that, you know, by the time they get out of high school, they actually know and understand what they're dealing with. And one of the interesting things that we have actually found by doing that through the DHS, and those programs are actually freely available. You can go on the DHS website, you will find those slide decks, you can actually use them. It gives you all the details, you have YouTube videos and everything. Those are stuff that is already being produced by the US government for people everywhere. Well, it was originally under the Obama administration that actually started that, but as I say, these programs are actually there. It's just that people are not aware of it. But one thing that we surveyed was interesting, and the survey came out, you know, when those kids who are actually 5 or 6 or even 7 years old, to go back home, they teach their parents. They tell their parents, you should not be doing this, you should not be doing that, because the teacher has told us, has showed us how to do. Now, if you go out on the street and try to explain to people, the chances are to get to them might be more difficult. However, if you start at an early age, and this is proven, now it's proven, and that's why it hasn't been removed. At least my new top boss hasn't changed it, because he's already accepted that this works. So literally what I'm saying is, what you really are looking for is basically, where do you start? How do you get that information out there? It exists. So basically, as again I said, go to the DHS website, Department of Homeland Security, and you would actually find loads of slides which talks about, you know, well, there's stuff about sexting, everything that you need to understand. And these are stuff which is really important, because sexting has become like an interesting part of our world today, and it's not too great as well, because when you do that, some part of that information is still leaking on the internet somewhere, and you know, as I said earlier, you might end up finding that X and Y is exchanging such and such words, and that doesn't look great. So basically what I'm suggesting, if we're really looking at trying to get people to understand, the culture everywhere is different. I have to agree with that. However, people use the internet more or less the same way. Everybody hears about Facebook, we run to it. Snapchat, run to it. You don't know what's really happening behind. Even though you don't read because it's too long, you agree. That's the other thing that people need to understand. Don't just agree to anything. It might say there in one line, somewhere in between that, you know, but in 24 hours I'll kill you, and you say agree? I mean, guys, come on. I know it's a long process, I agree, because it takes a bit of time to actually go through it, but, you know, you have to be sure. It's like when you go to the bank and you sign for a credit card, do you read that pamphlet? Do you know what's in there? The banker would tell you, well, you will get this credit line, this, and that. But they will never tell you what actions they're going to take against you if you default. That is never there. And people never ask it because you're getting the credit card. So who's at fault? Is it the banker or is it the person sitting in front of the banker? Actually, both is right. The other one doesn't want to tell you because you will run away. And you want the credit card because you didn't hear the backlog story behind it, you know, the suing part or whatever is in there, you know, you're going to get into trouble if you don't pay within time and whatever. So that's where the big problems start. You install apps on your smartphones. You install, like we say, you know, Microsoft has a motto for that. You install pirated version of Microsoft to start off, pirated versions of Office or whatever. It's your call because you're not downloading it from Microsoft. So what's in there? You don't know. There might be a Trojan horse sitting inside because you downloaded it from a torrent website and you installed it. And after that you get hit and you have all the information being leaked out. Is it the fault of Microsoft? You can't blame them for what you are doing because you're pirating yourself. And when you pirate, you're actually taking stuff from pirates actually who have actually modified the codes in there. So you have to, there has to be some balance. People need to understand that. I understand that it's expensive, so why not use open source? Unix is there, Ubuntu is actually a good one. Mr. Fosfa, chairman, is here. So, you know, if you can't, there are other ways of actually working it out. But even then, if it's open source, be sure that you read the, you know, the agreement properly, because in there are quite a few interesting things, and that was taught to me by a Microsoft guy himself. He was a vice president, and we were looking at it, and he said, "Did you read the agreement before you said agree on that little button on the bottom there?" I said, "No, I never read it through because, you know, everybody just says next, and agrees." And he said, "Do you know that you're not allowed to use this software in this country?" I was like, where's that? Where is it said? He said, "Well, it's in the agreement. You should look at it. Because if it's a US company, there are blacklisted countries in the world. example, Iran, Iraq, and other countries like Cuba, for example, all of these are countries which is banned, and that's written explicitly in that agreement. So, you know, there are two things to it. Start with early childhood and get to the top. And that's going to help Africans a lot. Believe me, that's going to help you guys a lot. It has proven itself. And obviously, make sure that you read the agreements. Don't just sign or agree, whatever. It's an electronic agreement. I was just telling Reverend Palayan earlier today, you know, when it comes to information, you just sit there and you just say, agree to anything. It doesn't work that way. You have to be more lenient and take a bit of time, rather than getting into something that you don't know. So when you're talking about data protection, of course, it's important. We are actually not talking only about data protection. We're talking about our own privacy. How much information do we want to have out there about ourselves? Do you want to be invisible? Then don't use the internet at all. Okay. And the best security, as one of my fellow colleagues from Deloitte, I was working for Deloitte in the old days, he said, you know, the best security is just take the jack off the wall and just run your computer. And make sure nobody touches it.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Chris. We'll just take two last questions, and then we'll round up. Okay, the gentleman over there, and then you'll be the last person.
Who's it? Okay. Who first? Me first?
Yes, you first.
Okay. I was just going to, I think our group actually had this conversation quickly earlier. So we did mention about the partnership with the media as a critical stakeholder. And we talked about the fact that, you know, a lot of people in Africa use transistor radios, especially on a particular demographic, you know, they use, so that's very critical. Secondly, we still talked about grassroots advocacy. You know, that's very, very important. For you to be able to get a critical mass, to get a strong movement going, you need to go to the grassroots. So we mentioned that as well. Then you and the university, you know, I work in your space, is working with you guys as clubs, you know, to become evangelists and champions in your environment. So you're like peer educators among your friends to be able to talk to yourselves about the importance of, you know, this phenomenon. You know, so those are the three things, and I think they were mentioned earlier in that. So my own challenge as a participant to all of us as well, even you, is that how do you begin to champion this, you know, in your own sphere of influence?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, you'll be the last person, and then.
Okay, my question has to do with data protection in relation to the labor market. While we're having our discussion, someone mentioned something about how these days, you know, when someone wants to apply for a job and the employer can bring out stuff about the person's private life through data and all. So I wanted to know if there were any laws that put limits on the amount of information you get on a person. I mean, employers, when people are trying to apply for a job or something, because it might get to a point where when one is applying for a job, they get paranoid about the fact that the employer that they're going to might dig up stuff about them, you know, in their past and all, and it might just not be based on their competence or based on what they have to bring to the table. So I want to know if there are any laws that put an embargo on the amount of, you know, information that an employer can dig into people that are applying for jobs. Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Okay, so typically data protection laws cover that, but the rule of thumb is that whatever information you put out in the public, the general rule is that it is deemed that you want that information out there for whoever can access it. Recently, I was doing a paper on employee monitoring in Ghana, and what it technically means is that if an employee, once you're seeking to be employed by someone and they decide to use your Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they are legally within their rights in terms of data protection laws to be able to source information out there. And that's why we warn the youth, when I was at the commission, for instance, to be extremely careful in how, because invariably it's affecting their future. A lot of the time when they're engaging on these platforms, they don't anticipate its implications in the future. So if you are putting things out there, as Titi once said, and I like to quote her, the internet is not born again, it doesn't forgive and forget. So just know that, and it's
Okay, so one last comment from Chuka,
yeah, I just wanted to comment regarding our immediate jurisdiction in Nigeria. Well, like it's been said over and over again, we do not have a particular data protection enactment in Nigeria. But what we do have are codifications in various regulations which can provide a shield to people, to how data is used. There is no extent to which, I mean, like she said already during the panel session, you have a right to privacy. But when the information is requested and you voluntarily give it up, the onus then shifts to the organization holding this information, and they are expected by certain codifications, for example, the NCC consumer regulation, there are lines in there that puts the responsibility on the information collector on how they deal with this information that they've collected, how it gets into the public domain, and things relating to your permission as well. And the Freedom of Information Act also deals with aspects of that. Like we've discussed over time, none of them can be as encompassing as having one Data Protection Act, which provides all the safe handles that we require I mean, that you would need to feel that your data is safe to an extent. But these regulations actually provide fail-safes, which put the onus on the collectors of this information, regulating how this information gets out there and how it's used, essentially.
Okay, thank you very much. I see Professor Chris and Nina's hands.
No, I just want to add something. Justifyingly, you asked a question about employment, you know, what data are you filling up online, basically. In many European, Asian, and even in the US, North America, you would fill in your form, and there are some parts of it where you can say you don't want to reply to that question specifically. You have the choice to do so. At the end of all the details you fill in, you would see there's an agreement form again. That agreement form, you have a tendency of saying you agree, because in that little, it's not too big because you're applying for employment, right? So it's about this size, not much. But it tells you that they have the right to investigate, and that's normal. They're going to check your background, they're going to do that, do this. It's written.
Even under the issue of consent, it can be justified as a legitimate interest of the data controller, because if I'm a bank and I need to employ people who are of a certain standard and integrity, then I can claim a legitimate, even if I'm not taking your prior consent, I can claim a legitimate interest right to be able to go behind your back without your prior consent to have access to that information.
Okay, last Nina, and that's the final person.
Yes, I just want to implore us to give the government and platforms and industry a breather, and maybe come back one step to personal responsibility. Exactly. People are saying, shift it out there, let the industry do this, let regulation do this. I think you have to take personal responsibility for your data. I mean, personal control comes with personal responsibility. And I am one of those who actually read end-user licenses. And I've read the updated user license agreement of Twitter. And I was shocked. And I think after I've read that, my tweeting has become calmer. Because the updated one says they have the right to, of course, once the data is on Twitter, content that is, the word used is content, okay? Once it goes on Twitter, it is available for everybody.
Yes.
And it's available for users today and users that will come in future. It is available to be reused by people who are on Twitter and people who are not on Twitter. It is available to be reused in media that is available today and media that will be created in future. You can go and read it again.
So can we clap for ourselves for a fantastic session? Okay, so with that said, I would like to call the events for today to a close and thank everyone, the panelists. Can we put our hands together for the panelists, first of all? Okay. And I would like to also thank the students from different universities who have attended the event for a fantastic participation. It's actually a balance of the demographics that we've been having. So thank you very much. Okay, so we would be rounding up now. We have tea break for those of us who are interested in having tea. And then we have our gala night starting by 7. So we're all invited. Please, it's going to be happening at the I House. So please locate the I House. It's just opposite the conference center, where we had lunch, exactly. 7. Yes, we should close before 10. So please come comfortable, and so we could prepare for another fantastic session tomorrow. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening.